I want to begin by thanking Tom Banshoff, the director of the Berkeley Center, not only for hosting this event and inviting me to do it, but also for appointing me as a research fellow at the Berkeley Center this past year. The Berkeley Center has been my intellectual home away from home for the past year. It's an extraordinary institution. I've learned so much from being here, so it's been both an honor and a great learning experience to be affiliated with the institution. I'm really grateful for that. And I want to thank George Schulman for many things, for coming down from New York to talk about my book. I know George mostly through his own amazing book, American Prophecy, Race and Redemption in American Political Culture. It's an extraordinary book. I'm not the only one to think so. It's the winner of the Easton Prize in Political Science, which is an extremely prestigious award. It's an incredible book, and it's an honor for me to have George reading my work. An honor and a pleasure, too. George wrote one of the endorsements for the back of the book, and I had the rare experience of reading his short comment about my own work and learning more about my own work from it. So George is an incredible reader of political theory. Thank you so much for coming down here and for coming to discuss my work. I circulated in advance a couple of chapters of my book. But what I'm going to do in my presentation today is give more of an introduction to the project and an overview. So this book is about the problematic intersection of religion and politics in modern and contemporary periods, primarily. It has just come out from Cambridge in this beautiful and expensive hardback edition. They promise there will be an equally beautiful but less expensive paperback edition before too long. The center of the book, so the title of the book is Beyond Church and State, Democracy, Secularism, and Conversion. And the central topic of the book is secularism. What I'm doing, first and foremost in the book, is challenging a basic assumption about secularism, the assumption that secularism is equivalent to the separation of church and state. For non-specialist audiences, I pretty much stop the argument at that point and work through that, because there's enough to say just in making that claim. But with you all, too, I want to take the argument all the way that I do in the book and say my argument is that secularism is not equivalent to separation of church and state, that it's equivalent really to a process of transformation, and further that we should understand this transformation as a process of conversion. Now, this argument unfolds in a really polemical space. It's a space occupied by secularists and anti-secularists and post-secularists and now anti-post-secularists. But my book, as I understand it, is not a polemic. What I'm trying to do is open this question in ways that will be interesting to and challenging for people situated across this spectrum. And the kind of claim that I want to make is, too, that when we move past this idea of seeing secularism as a separation of church and state, that we can begin to understand more clearly how both religion and politics are being continually transformed in modern public life, on the one hand, and how this very transformation itself is a primary question, or a question of primary importance for understanding and thinking about democracy. For the next few minutes, I'm going to go through the argument of the book. And what I want to actually do is give three different perspectives on the book. So here are three short sketches of the argument of the book. First sketch. This book's about secularism. And I have to note right away that that very term, secularism, is currently contested in 1,000 ways. Even terminologically, some scholars prefer to focus on secularity, or secularization, or secularists, or the secular. And I spent some time in the book parsing those terms, but my interest really lies in the complex assemblage that encompasses all of them. And I refer to that slightly unwieldy object of study as the modern secular imaginary, or simply as modern secularism. So my book is about secularism on the one hand, and it's about conversion on the other. The project actually started with an idea about conversion. That idea was that this specifically theological figure named a kind of change, a truly radical change, that was both particular to religious experience, but also identifiable within modern public and political life more broadly. I thought of conversion as a kind of a change, a transformation, both for individuals and for communities, that could not be explained within the frameworks of persuasion, deliberation, or decision that prevailed in the field of political theory in which I was being trained. A conversion, I thought, is an event. And the arrival of this event cannot be predicted or adequately prepared for. The arrival of this event produces a rupture within a life, again, either a personal life or a collective life. I realized quickly that the term conversion, however, refers to a wide range of phenomena in a variety of historical and cultural contexts. And I decided that I couldn't track this variety the way an historian or an anthropologist might, that there are simply too many things that have been called conversion to undertake that. So instead, as a political theorist, I tried to invent really, conversion as a concept for theorizing politics. And as such, my concept of conversion has three key dimensions. First, it entails a significant transformation of the self. Second, it resituates an individual in relation to a community, or a community in relation to a larger tradition or collective. It entails joining, leaving, affirming, or re-articulating a collectivity. And third, it requires the production of a new self-narrative, which both catalyzes and consolidates the experience of conversion by retrospectively marking a moment of discontinuity, change, or rebirth within the convert's life course, and naming this as the moment of conversion. Conversion seemed by no means merely a religious phenomenon, but one that occurs instead within politics generally. And this dimension of change was generally overlooked in political thought, so it seemed to me, and I figured that it had been excluded from consideration because modern political thought is committed to excluding religion from politics. Now that was more or less as far as I got in my dissertation, and when I completed it, I dutifully filed a copy with the library. I put another copy in the box, and I went out to learn more about the wider world of the academy, the wider world beyond graduate school, the wider world beyond political theory. To make a long story short about those journeys, when I came back to my project, I realized that conversion isn't excluded from theories of politics by chance. So I realized instead, first, that modern politics is constituted in important senses through the exclusion of religion, and with it conversion. And second, that this process of separating politics from religion can itself be thought of as a process of conversion. So my task was then to show that we should think of secularism in terms of conversion, that we should think of conversion as a multifaceted process which projects a separation on its authorized surface, at the same time that it maintains a continuity in its crystalline depths, and that we can see something new about modern secularism, about the specific politics of modern secularism, by grasping the dynamic relation of these two facets of conversion. At any rate, that's how I remember the genesis of the book. If you had a chance to read the chapter on Augustine, you'll know that I'm somewhat skeptical about those kind of retrospective narratives, but nonetheless, I think we can't do without them. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it for now. Second sketch. Okay, so my book's about modernity, secularism, and conversion. Now, the first of these two terms, modernity and secularism, obviously go along together quite nicely. They're twins, really. And that third element, conversion, should appear dissonant at first. What does a religious figure of conversion have to do with secular modernity? A secular modernity which has so often been imagined as an age of reason, or a scientific age, or a technological age, at least an age without magic. An age of reason that's inaugurated precisely through a break from traditional religious authority. The connection here lies in part in how we tell the story of modernity. The emergence of secular modernity is consistently narrated in terms of a conversion narrative. The old man passes through a crisis, a figurative death, and emerges, is reborn as the new man. Western Christendom passes through the crisis of religious warfare and reemerges as modern secular Europe. I'm simplifying here, but such narratives are widespread and persistent. Indeed, in his recent influential account, Charles Taylor tells a story in which the secular age emerges from a time of naive religiosity, through, I would point out, a process of conversion. So I argue that we talk about ourselves and our world in the unacknowledged terms of a conversion narrative. Usually when we describe ourselves as modern, we mean to say we've broken with the religious past. That kind of story is more or less common sense, but what's puzzling, of course, is that the world doesn't conform very well to that story. And I think that's true both in the United States and globally, Europe, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, everywhere it seems. To put a point on it, while our world is distinctly modern in many ways, it doesn't really seem to be a secular world, at least not if secularism is understood as an arrangement in which politics has been effectively separated from and operates freely of religion, in which religion has been effectively privatized and removed from public life. I'm aware, on the one hand, that this is not news. The crisis of secularism and the return of religion are by now truly old headlines, and they've been punched up by a whole generation of scholars, but they continue, they remain as headlines nonetheless, and I think that's because we as scholars and as citizens aren't done thinking and working our way through the new relations between religion and politics that we see today. So many of our questions are getting old and many of our positions are polemically entrenched. But my aim in this book is to think about the formations of modern secularism and modern religion in new ways and to open new horizons for thinking and acting within this problematic space. So in my book, I ask why it is that we're stuck within the authorized terms of a conversion narrative. I ask, that is, why we persist in imagining ourselves and our time as having broken with the religious past. Why it is, in short, that we continue to understand secularism in terms of separation. argue that we should indeed think of secularism in terms of conversion, but not in the bare terms of a conversion narrative that posits a break with the past. Positing a break is part of the transformation named by conversion, but it's only one part of a multifaceted process. Conversion, I argue, is a crystalline structure, constituted and driven by the multiple layers of transformation hidden below the authorized surface. Secularism, likewise, is a process that transforms religion and politics, continuously, beneath the banner idea of their separation. So my position, in short, isn't anti-secular or post-secular or anti-post-secular. I do argue that we can analyze secularism more precisely by focusing on transformation rather than separation, and that shifting our perspective in this way reveals more and better political options. Third and final sketch. My book's thesis can be stated in 3 parts. First, secularism is not now, and in fact never has been, primarily a matter of separating religion and politics, despite the prevalence of that authorized view. And it is a prevalent view, and it's hard to get around the idea of secularism as separation. Second, secularism has been and continues to be a process that transforms religion and politics. Third, in a Euro-American context, and in a global context even, if we do it carefully, it will be useful to think of that process of transformation as a process of crystalline conversion. To develop that thesis, I draw upon a figure of conversion that I develop in dialogue with thinkers such as Augustine, Locke, Rawls, Bergson, and Cavell. I argue that the commonplace image of secularism as a separation of church and state presents an obstacle to the development of a more genuinely democratic politics, and that figuring secularism as a process of conversion may open new possibilities for democracy within the condition of deep pluralism that marks contemporary global politics. So insofar as this book aims to move its readers toward a new perspective on a familiar problem, its objective, and thus to some extent its writing, reflects its subject matter. It's a book about secularism and conversion that aims to produce a certain kind of conversion in its reader's view of secularism. And that's worth doing, I argue, because secularism is a central and an essentially contested component of modern democracy. Precisely because arguments over the very meaning of this term can be expected to persist, it's of critical importance to engage them. So secularism is a moving target. But while its forms change over time, it consistently names those processes that continuously recontour both religious and political life. The metaphor of a wall of separation between church and state, for example, most famously employed in the early 19th century by Thomas Jefferson, although it long predates him, is currently the authorized emblem of modern secularism. It actively shapes American constitutional jurisprudence. It circulates widely in public debates, within popular consciousness, and even within contemporary theoretical analyses. The idea of separation lies at the core of many of today's most important debates about secularism. Debates that turn around questions such as these: whether political discourse can be separated from religious discourse, whether political institutions are separate from religious institutions, whether modern Western secularism is separate from the religious traditions that have conditioned it, whether and how the West's apparent secularism separates it from the non-Western world. The separation of church and state remains a fundamental and persistent part of the modern secular imaginary, to be sure, but it's also, just as certainly, an imperfect characterization of modern secularism. Secularism today is neither primarily a matter of separating religion from the major domains of modern life, including politics, economics, science, morality, and the arts, nor has it ever primarily been a matter of separating religion from these domains. Secularism has instead always been a crystalline process of transformation that produces and reshapes key dimensions of both political and religious life. So figuring the emergence of modern secularism as a process of conversion shows how secularism has in fact emerged in new and distinctly modern forms by reshaping institutions, practices, sensibilities, communities, and discourses. In the book, that's what I call the crystalline process. It also shows how these transformations are catalyzed and obscured by a simplifying image of secularism as a separation of church and state. In the book, that's what I call the authorized surface. The multi-layered structure of conversion is evident in Augustine's Confessions, which suggests a complex crystalline process of ethical character formation that's represented, refigured, simplified, consolidated, and obscured by an authorized narrative of conversion. In the book, I read Locke's advocacy of early modern toleration as an example of how institutions are contested and transformed within a crystalline process. And I cite our contemporary reception of such transformations as an example of how authorized narratives flatten out and obscure this process. I argue that the same dynamics can be observed throughout the social transformations that produced modern Euro-American secularism, transformations which entailed a long, slow, quiet, and crystalline conversion of political and religious sensibilities, and transformations which have since been obscured by authorized conversion narratives that simplify and consolidate their outlines. So, and this is to wrap up, my argument is that we typically exaggerate the separation between religion and politics. And I apply a specifically religious figure, namely conversion, to a central category of politics, namely secularism, to start thinking through the implications of letting these fields cross one another. To figure secularism as a process of conversion is also to propose a new way of thinking about the connection between secularism and Christianity. It represents one way of drawing on the resources of religious or spiritual traditions to rethink problematic categories of the political. A theory of secularism based on the figure of conversion registers multiple forms of connection between Christianity and secularism, but without reducing secularism to Christianity, which I think is important. So finally, I argue that we think of secularism as separation, and that we shouldn't think of it this way. And then I try and think of it instead as transformation, more specifically as conversion, and to draw the consequences of doing so. Thank you.
I don't need a microphone. Do I need a microphone?
If she's going to get you, yeah, I think.
Oh.
If I park it next to you, then maybe it won't be so alarming.
Okay.
Gonna need to be alone.
I'm a short guy. It's like, I feel like I'm staring at the microphone. That was a great summary. So it makes me want to sort of change what I wrote, but I can, on the assumption that Jose would be here, I decided to focus entirely on the trope of conversion, and not on all the arguments about secularization and secularism and so on. And consequently, I don't talk about those things really, but listening to Matt recount the book, I guess I had two thoughts to add at the beginning. One is that the reason for the argument about conversion is that it's something he and I share, which is that views of politics that exclude religion exclude too much of life in that exclusion of religion. And so by Matthew taking from religion the language of conversion to talk about quote-unquote secularization is immediately to accomplish something about thinking about our categories in our lives differently. And that's something that I try to do in my own work, or did try to do in my prophecy book. But let me focus, but what my comments today are really directed at the question of conversion, and I'm thinking about it not in the terms that generated the book, that is, the terms in which a certain misunderstanding of history is produced by the narrative of conversion to secularism, but I'm thinking about conversion as a trope for change and how we think about change. So my question for the day is, how does his reworking of the figure of conversion help us rethink personal and political change? That reworking is sustained by an ontology often called life philosophy. This optic understands life as a process and being as becoming, so that symbolic order, habitus, identity, and practice, culture in its many senses, appears as sedimentation or objectification that life generates and exceeds and disrupts and transforms. Human conventions are then brought before the tribunal not of God or truth, but of life. I take this to be the legacy of Bergson, who's very important in Matt's reworking of conversion. The central question is not whether a practice enacts God's will, embodies justice, or is validated by reason, but whether it serves the ongoing vitality of the life that animates our being. The central impulse is thus to resist reification and to open conventions to our creativity and to what is emergent but not yet apprehended or valued. Then agency is not seen as a choice between A and B or between reason and unreason, but as a transforming capacity to create new fields of possibility. The central tension in this optic was memorably voiced by Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, as a relation between the Dionysian and the Apollonian, between the endless, senseless, creative, and destructive energies of becoming on the one hand, and the symbolic and conventional forms by which human beings consolidate ways of life, individuate being, and endow meaning. In Matthew's Bergsonian terms, the flux of life congeals as a crystalline structure, in illuminating metaphor evoking the multiple facets and layers of impulse, attachment, habit, consciousness that consolidate or stabilize our being. But different aspects of the crystal become susceptible to reconfiguration in moments, in what he calls moments of indetermination, when old habits or inherited forms fail and new ones emerge. This broad optic and this specific metaphor, Matthew argues, require us to reimagine what he calls the authorized image of conversion. For the complexity of a crystal shows how we change through an ongoing and partial reworking of facets of our being, not by a clean break and total change from an old identity or paradigm to a new one. In retrospect, people will narrate conversion in such a polarized before and after way, as in the story of secularism itself, but this falsifies how change in fact happened and happens. In actuality, conversion names not a passage from old to wholly new, but what Matthew calls an intersection where forces of closure and forces of openness meet, and we reconfigure what remains stable and what we change. Matthew still defines conversion as what he calls a significant transformation, as he did in his comments a moment ago. But rather than a dramatic event inaugurating a new way of life, he invokes Bergson to imagine conversion as, I'm quoting here, a continuously renewed process that jostles and adjusts the crystalline structure of identity. As I turn now to consider how this view of conversion resonates for me and what it implies for us, bear with me as I unpack both my affirming yes and my hesitating or equivocal no. Reading Matthew confirmed my own attraction to versions of life philosophy. Ever since, in my own days in graduate school, I suspended myself between Marx's dialectical and Nietzsche's Dionysian versions of vitalism. I see Matthew taking up the politicized phenomenology that, through Merleau-Ponty, Frantz Fanon, and Norman O. Brown, enabled the left Nietzschean view of democratic politics to emerge among my own cohort. This optic remains attractive to me because it emphasizes embodiment and experience on one side and difference in motion on the other side, and because it sustains a fruitful tension between flux and form, or in Arendt's terms, between life and world. Matthew's Bergsonian optic adds complexity and thickness to that tension by showing how the many facets of being are layered and embedded in a dense habitus. By stretching out conversion as a continually renewing process, he fruitfully joins interiority, experience, and duration to an ethnographic view of practice. Still, I remain attached to aspects of the authorized image of conversion as a condition of radical democratic politics. This is the hesitating, equivocal no. The motto of the SCLC was to save the soul of America, because their political project sought a dramatic and inaugural conversion in the radical sense that Matthew seems to displace. That authorized image also sustained new left and countercultural ideas of a great refusal, a romantic trope of transformation, no doubt, but linked to what was empowering and not only disastrous in the 60s radical democracy. To overcome a reified, alienating habitus and to achieve emotional intensity and existential authenticity were two sides of one participatory project in democracy. A third facet, to use Matthew's metaphor, opposed instrumental rationality as a mind-forged manacle, to quote Blake, to embrace the intuitive, the experiential, and aesthetics as a micropolitics opening the doors of perception. In every regard, activists and theorists depicted a dramatic event inaugurating a new way of life or reanimating deadened and deadening forms. Even for Bergson, shifting attention to duration and becoming is described as a conversion experience, initiating a new practice of life that is intense and inspiriting. I wanted to read a little Bergson here. My claim is that he actually uses a reading of conversion that Matt's displacing. The matter and life which fill the world are equally within us. The forces which are working in all things we feel in ourselves. Whatever may be the inner essence of what is and what is done, we are of that essence. Let us then go down into our inner selves, for the world into which our senses and consciousness habitually introduce us is no more than the shadow of itself, and it is cold as death. Everything in it is arranged for our maximum convenience, but in it everything is in a present which seems constantly to be starting afresh, and we ourselves, fashioned artificially in the image of a no less artificial universe, speak of the past as something done away with. Let us, on the contrary, grasp ourselves afresh as we are, in a present which is thick and furthermore elastic, which we can stretch indefinitely backward by pushing back the screen which masks us from ourselves. Let us grasp afresh the external world as it really is, not superficially in the present, but in depth. Let us become accustomed to seeing all things sub species durationis. Immediately, in our galvanized perception, what is taut becomes relaxed, what is dormant awakens, and what is dead comes to life again. As we penetrate into our everyday life, what was immobile and frozen in our perception is warmed and set in motion. Everything comes to life around us, everything is revivified in us, and we are more fully alive. And then he says, when he asks us to turn attention aside from the part of the universe which interests us from a practical viewpoint, to turn our attention back toward what serves no practical purpose, he says this conversion of the attention would be philosophy itself. But the paradox, of course, is that Bergson's conversion rests on seeing temporality in a more elastic way. But it never, so there's a paradox in this. So I see a kind of slippage, and it's really complicated. Matthew quotes Pierre Hadot saying both that people make an existential decision to convert to philosophy as a way of life, and that this conversion is a condition of entry into practicing this new kind of care of self. But then Matthew adds that this conversion is itself cultivated or engendered by that life. In his reworking, then, conversion at once inaugurates a new practice and is enabled by it. Now, we could say this is Rousseau's paradox. How can we be before the law what we can only become by way of it? But my sense is that Matthew makes ongoing cultivation the foregrounded meaning of conversion, that continuously renewing process, by moving Hadot's existential decision into the background. Then conversion appears as a continuous practice of modification, not as a dramatic inaugural event, as a crisis and decision that initiates that process. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe there is real value in an embedded and layered view of change as a continuous process of reconfiguration. I also think that before and after narratives can often be a form of disavowal. If we disturb the polarized structure of an exceptionalist or romanticized, or as Libby would say, melodramatic politics, we can see how innovation has enabling conditions, how change at one layer is enabled by stability at another, and how change in one facet of our crystalline being can ramify over time in other regards. Matt's reworking of conversion thus resonates with psychoanalytic practice, with ethnographies of democratic activism as a transformative practice. It conjures democratic enactment as both self-shaping and world-building, and not so much as radical rupture. But if we diminish the sense of conversion as a dramatic and inaugural event, we may lose the capacity to distinguish change that is systemic, significant, or deep from change that is incremental, incidental, or palliative. This formulation, of course, betrays my attachment to the very image and narrative of conversion that Matthew wants to displace, or he may want to displace. But the question remains, how do we imagine and what do we count as significant change? Matthew grants that conversion means, quote unquote, significant transformation, but I want to press right at that point because I wonder if his framework allows him to identify it, and because I think that if we value the significance of change, we cannot move the authorized image of conversion so far into the background. We have to live more with this sort of paradoxical relationship. I would press on the difference between a theory that presumes ceaseless change and seeks reconfiguration on the one hand, and a theory that depicts systemic crisis to provoke paradigm change on the other hand. This may distinguish Bergson from Sheldon Wolin, to use a political theorist's shorthand, but it is more useful to see how this distinction is internal to Nietzsche, whose Dionysian optics still allowed him to depict a crisis of nihilism and to call for a revaluation of all values. He saw ceaseless becoming ontologically, but at the level of history, he foresaw both the disaster of fascism and the impasse of mass society and the last man. James Baldwin, too, saw life as ceaseless change, while depicting a present trapped by a past whose power was intractable because it was disavowed. For Baldwin, only a conversion, in Hadot's sense, an existential and political decision to turn toward what and who we disavow, could initiate regime change in a way of life. Depicting a systemic crisis, these figures seek to radically transform a community's constitutive practices. One might respond, so much the worse for them, because they bespeak the very genre of crisis and radicality that we must give up if we are to credit the complexity of change and the limits of change both. Accordingly, I would affirm Matt's view of conversion as appearing in a zone of indetermination between the failing and the emergent. But I wonder if we need more historical specificity to identify what kind or scope or scale or degree of change is really needful in one particular historical moment or political moment compared to another. To dramatize this, let me conclude by situating his account of conversion between two others, thinking of our moment right now. On one side is Jonathan Lear's Radical Hope, which asks what it means for a form of life to end, to cease being possible or credible, and so also what it might mean to go on if a form of life can't. He depicts the crow going through the motions of a life whose practices have lost their meaning and practical viability. Truly a moment of crisis. In response, Lear's hero, Plentycoo, enacts a dramatic conversion from that dying life, but without instantiating a new one. He models only a capacity to posit the essential goodness of life, despite our dark moment, and the courage to project possibility beyond the criteria that once defined the good life for his people. I'm not actually trying to set this up as an ideal, but just a contrast. In contrast to Lear, Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism depicts crisis normalized as an impasse in which we are diminished by the good life we seek, but we are unable to let go of it or imagine alternatives. And you get lots of small modifications in life that she celebrates as what politics is now. Sympathetically, she depicts a zone of indetermination and limited improvisation, but no new conditions of possibility. Now, I place, in effect, Matthew between these two, which may be sort of false, but I mean it in a way to provoke thinking about the question of how we understand change, which I take to be the question at the heart of Matthew's book. I place him between these two to suggest how his book does bespeak our zeitgeist, where we're trying to figure out change, but also to suggest the political questions that it provokes for me. Thank you.
I think when I was thanking people at the beginning, I forgot. Thank you, George.
Yeah.
I think I forgot to thank all of you for coming. And I want to let you talk. I don't just want to say thank you and not let you talk by way of. I want to have a conversation with you. It's, I feel very privileged as, an author to have an audience for a book, but not just an audience of such great people to talk with. George was kind enough to give me a copy of his comments beforehand, and I have so many things I want to say, but before I let everyone else talk, I just want to respond to 2 points that he brought up briefly, and then I will contain myself. And because I think the question that George puts to me is a really hard question, and he's right to bring me back to conversion, which I indicated is where this project started. And it, in some ways, grew away from conversion into a focus on secularism. But to bring me back to conversion, to thinking of conversion as a way of understanding or working through the problem of change and political change in particular. And so the question that I hear from George is really, well, how does political change happen? Or, to put it less passively, how does it get done? How do we get political change done if we're interested in democratic politics, as I profess to be, or a more radical or genuine democracy? And George is suggesting, as I hear him, that sometimes we do need to will change. We need to choose it. We need to make decisions. We need to articulate programs. We need to press for breaks and ruptures. And all of this he associates with an authorized mode of conversion. We need to posit a break actively, voluntarily. And he's suggesting that my political preference is to display that mode of political agency in favor of the crystalline version, which appears as incremental and may not even be able to identify change and certainly not be able to spur it, a real change. And so I want to answer to that in so many ways, but I'm going to restrict myself. And I want to say first that I do think we always have both, that the process of conversion involves a crystalline depth with an authorized surface. But it is completely fair what George says, that I emphasize the crystalline at the expense of the authorized. Why? How do I think I can do that? Because I think that the eventful nature of conversion isn't restricted simply to the authorized face, that the crystalline depths are themselves eventful. And it comes to the question of how we think the event or how we think change. So I said, and George reaffirmed, that I started thinking of, and I continue to think of conversion as an event within an individual or collective life, but I'm also thinking of it as a possible response to an event, right? And so one of the first and most important things that I came to with conversion is that conversion is not initiated by the individual. Conversion happens to an individual. And so how do we get from this sort of thought to thinking about politics and political change? Well, let's just think of some events. Events are often, for Bergson, events are lovely, but events in our time, or in my perspective, are often quite horrible. So 3 recent or ongoing events. September 11th, 2001. Not just the moment of terrorist attacks, but the response, the transformative response on the part of Americans in the American state to that event. Things shifted. Things were opened and things closed down quite quickly. That event could have opened the possibility of strengthening international institutions and addressing the conditions that produce terrorism. Instead, that event went in a very different direction. It went into a unilateral and militarized direction. It promoted security. There was an opening, and it closed down in a certain way. The financial crisis that we date to 2008 is another event and an opening, a horrible one. It's turning into the unraveling of social democracy and the diminishment of life chances for millions of people around the world. What else could it have been? It could have been an opening for reconsidering the terms of financial capitalism, an opening for, if not that brave a gesture, regulation of financial capital, or some sort of progressive and positive, in my view, political transformation. There's an event. It's uncertain how that event will be decided. Climate change. There's an event that's only arriving with us still. What is going to happen? Will we find crop failures, displacement of millions, collapse of government economy, and the wealthy and privileged retreating into gated communities? Maybe. Will we be able to mobilize a different sort of democratic response to the event of climate change and the danger posed by it. What I'm getting at in thinking about these events is that, to my mind, the crystalline depths of conversion, or the crystalline moment of conversion, focuses us on what is often thought of as the initial moment of conversion, the opening of ourselves, the tumbling of our former interests, communities, commitments, attachments, understandings, worlds. Right? So the crystalline process of conversion is, for the most part, the deactivation of habit in response to the event, the opening of possibility for the formation of new habit, which is only afterwards retrospectively consolidated in the authorized mode. And so I need to think more about it, and I hear George's comment that politics is about initiating these changes. My response in favoring or promoting the crystalline mode is to say, well, politics is also about opening yourself and responding to those changes in new and creative ways. Bergson talks about opening the soul to the oncoming wave that is duration, creativity, and life itself. That there is a moment of political possibility there that is democratic, that is potentially radical, that is worth thinking about and embracing. Which leads me to the second point, which I'll do much more quickly, is the question of historical specificity. And sometimes I think to myself, my God, this project is horribly abstract, but it's not. It's quite specific to discussions that happen in this room among people like this, and which are influential, about the ongoing crisis in understandings and institutions of secularism. The real shifts in religion in a U.S. and in a global context. And so, to go back to the event, I want to say that secularism is an event. It's an unfolding event. And what I'm trying to think about is how we can respond to that, not in an authorized mode that redefines secularism, closes down discussion, ends possibilities, but that opens us to understanding, judging, and involving ourselves with the transformations in religious and political life that are unfolding in this very moment as we experience shifts in the structure of modern secularism. But there, I'm stopping myself. Thank you for your patience with me.